I will be analyzing the primary source document Federalist 64 by John Jay. 1787 and 1788 were landmark years for establishing a new governmental system capable of maintaining the new nation of the United States. This new system was proposed through the Constitution, which needed 9 out of 13 votes in favor of its ratification in order to be put into practice. Some of the most outspoken framers and supporters of the Constitution, known as Federalists, decided to launch a year-long campaign of sorts, which wound up being a collection of 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pseudonym Publius. These periodical pieces were essentially persuasive essays looking to sway the everyday American citizen's opinion on the Constitution towards ratification. Jay's Federalist 64 is a prime example of one of the Federalist papers written at the midpoint of the constitutional conventions and debates. Published on March 5, 1788, it was Jay's final contribution to the Federalist Papers, but the start to a small series of papers on the powers of the Senate. Although he contributed the least amount of Federalist papers, just 5, he was a major leader in the Federalist Party and an exceptionally influential figure in his birth state of New York, where he focused most of his efforts. Jay's experiences and knowledge lent themselves to the topic of foreign treaties that were discussed in Federalist 64, and he had extensive practice as an international diplomat, working as an ambassador to Spain, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, and especially being employed as a Secretary of Foreign Affairs before, during, and after the publication of Federalist 64. As the Secretary, Jay was known for his efforts to create foreign policy for America that could stand the test of time, and this was reflected in his writing. Though Federalist 64 is addressed to the people of New York, it can be inferred that its intended audience is actually the nation as a whole, specifically the states that had not yet ratified the Constitution. Jay began by expressing his goals for how the country should continue on as united as possible, with the distribution of governmental power adequate enough to be effective in meeting the nation's needs. He felt that he had people behind him in this belief, but they just needed to be steered in the right direction, towards what was best for the common good. He then went on to discuss the prioritization of the safety of the people that the Constitution would provide if adopted and followed. This was an easily comprehensible point that resonated with everyday common man due to the obvious and recent failure of the Articles of Confederation to keep individual towns and cities safe. These failures affected many different populations, such as the merchants due to the British blockade, shippers due to the closure of certain foreign ports, Southern farmers due to Spain's closure of the mouth of the Mississippi River, and frontiersmen due to the continued occupation of northwest British forts. With his points on general safety, Jay transitioned into the topic of hostility and future war, specifically what exactly would cause them. He did not discriminate between the danger of foreign and domestic affairs, such as British encroachment and Jay's rebellion, from arms and influence, as Federalist 64 put it. However, he went on to prioritize the threat of international security breaches, a topic he continued with for the remainder of the paper. After the importance of foreign dangers was communicated, Jay discussed his theory that there was a proportion in the world between the amount of wars and the amount and the seriousness of the causes. As a diplomat, he was well acquainted with what exactly caused a declaration of war, from the smallest nuance to the most blatant act of violence. His readers, however, did not know this, but it was obvious that the mystery writer had a widespread knowledge on the topic, which gave his words more credibility than otherwise. In the paper, Jay stated that in almost all conflicts, the cause is provocation by violence or by violating a treaty's terms. Specifically referencing the outstanding treaties that the U.S. was involved with, directly after saying this, is clearly meant as a warning to the people and the future government that violation of these treaties is not to be taken lightly, and war is a very likely outcome. In the next section, the true message of the paper is communicated by Jay, beginning with a statement on how vital it is to observe the rules of treaties, and in order to effectively do so, Jay writes, "This will be more perfectly and more punctually done by one national government than it could be by either 13 separate states or by 3 or 4 distinct confederacies." This was a huge point to bring up, as it directly addresses the Federalist viewpoint on favoring a strong central government, and by having the Federalists endorse the Constitution in such a way, this communicated that the Constitution would make this Federalist goal a reality. He defended this point with the fact that the best and the brightest in the country had to offer were in positions of power in the federal government. So they were the obvious choice to entrust with the matter of whether or not the United States would start a war. In addition, he brings up the point that foreign governments could not as easily trust a state government or two as they could a nation's strong central governmental body to follow through on the provisions of a treaty. By granting treaty-making as a federal power, the Constitution would in turn make foreign policy much more effective, efficient, and able to present a unified front than it ever could be otherwise. The next passage of the paper was an ode to Republican virtues, which explored in particular checks and balances in the form of representative government. Jay firmly acknowledged that self-interest would be a huge issue if the responsibility of foreign affairs were to be put in the hands of state governments due to their lack of access to the bigger picture. The state's concentration on short-term losses and gains, as illustrated by their use of all different currency during the Articles government, despite it hurting the nation with inflation, was something that Jay did not want people to overlook. He argued vehemently that the states had too much pride and too much to prove that opposed to the central government, they would be effortlessly manipulated by any foreign government they were to interact with. In his mind, this may have led to treaties the United States could not uphold, or even the breaking of the treaties already in existence, simply due to local circumstances that clouded non-federal leaders' judgments and viewpoints. However, he was also sure to bring checks and balances into the equation because the elected officials, especially those in the Senate, who he wanted to be the ones voting on the treaties, are directly put in their positions by the states, giving the states fair representation in foreign affairs. Jay farther supported his claims that the federal government was the only way to go in the next section by bringing up Native American conflicts. He references the fact that Indian hostility has only been brought on by individual states and groups of citizens and has not been instigated nor fathered by aggression from a federal level. With this, Jay attempted to prove that the national government could rise and stay above local issues to preserve the common good. His intent with including this was to speak directly to Northwestern citizens that were egging on the ever-growing Pontiac Confederacy by blatantly ignoring the Ohio River border set by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Jay then went on to describe that the states bordering Spanish and British territories would also be much more easily inflamed. This matter would only be farthered because Spain and Britain had strained diplomatic relationships with the United States and could easily be able to sway a border state to betray the nation, something Jay was positive would happen if the states were given more responsibility. Jay's largest task in Federalist 64 was communicating to the people how the Constitution would attempt to reconcile the Republican virtues the public expected the nation to live up to and the realities of foreign policy and relations. The intricacies of international dealings were not easy for the everyday citizen to understand, especially not the haste that was necessary, but lacking under the Articles government. However, by discussing the disorganization of the state's government, attempting to work cohesively, Jay demonstrated that the extra paperwork and maneuvering involved in such an endeavor would be dangerous to the stability of the United States' relationships with other nations. His message was that the Constitution would contain a balance between secrecy within the central government in order to actually get things done with the required speed, and the incorporation of the will and the voice of the people whom were being governed. Jay made a convincing case that if the Constitution were to put the Senate with its expertise on foreign policy, and the President with his intimate relationships with both the United States and other nations, as leaders in international relations and treaty-making, the nation would be far more stable. When the Two-Thirds Treaty was approved by the framers of the Constitution on September 8, 1787, the reasoning for passing it was exactly what Jay described in Federalist 64, so the validity of his words cannot be easily refuted. After the Constitution was ratified in August 1788, Jay continued to be an eminent Federalist and became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and continued his diplomacy work, negotiating treaties.